300 people were standing in the ballroom of the Ashford estate that Saturday night, and most of them already knew why the little table by the kitchen door had a card on it. It read, "Reserved Service Staff." Vivian Ashford had put that table in the middle of the floor where nobody could miss it, and she'd spent the whole week making sure the right people knew exactly who was supposed to sit there. Not one of them told her that was enough. By 8:40, the chair was still empty. Vivian kept glancing at it. Her fiancé kept glancing at the front entrance. The string quartet played on. At 8:47, 4 black cars came up the drive and stopped at the bottom of the steps. And the music stopped with them. Nobody had told the valets those cars were coming. Nobody had told anyone. The doors opened. Chloe Callahan walked into that ballroom, with her chin up, and her hand resting on the arm of a man in a black suit, no apron, no uniform, wearing a gown that hadn't come off any rack, set with stones that only 2 people in that entire room could have put a number on. 300 guests turned to look at her. Then they looked at the man beside her, and the room went so quiet you could hear a chair scrape at the back. Vivian's father stood up too fast and knocked his own chair over. Her fiancé took half a step backward and dropped his glass on the marble. And Vivian Ashford, in the middle of her own engagement party, in front of every single person she'd ever wanted to impress, looked at that man's face, then looked down at the hand resting on his arm, and her knees simply went out from under her. She went down onto the floor and covered her face with both hands. She wasn't crying over the dress. She was crying over who was wearing it, and over which man had put it on her. If stories about dignity and second chances mean something to you, hit that like button and subscribe. Share this one with somebody who needs to hear it tonight. It really does help this channel grow. Now, let's go back to where it all began. 9 days before that night, Chloe Callahan was still standing behind the bar at the Coral Room at 11 o'clock at night, with no idea that her life was about to be turned upside down. The place sat on the ground floor of an old building in Bridgeport, and only got truly crowded on weekends. The rest of the time, it was filled with familiar faces coming and going according to schedules of their own. Marlene Hoffman had been managing the night shift there for 20 years. She was 54, with a voice made rough by cigarettes she had never quite managed to quit, and she had one unwritten rule. She never allowed a female employee to go home alone after 2 o'clock in the morning. Kayla Doyle had only been working there for 4 months. She was 23, and her hands still trembled whenever she carried a tray toward a crowded table, and every time a customer raised his voice, she instinctively backed toward the bar as though searching for somewhere to hide. Chloe was different. 6 years standing in that place had taught her something no school could ever teach. She remembered people's faces. She remembered their voices. She remembered who sat at which table, what they ordered, who they came in with, and what they said to that person. It wasn't because she was curious. At first, it had simply been a way to work faster, so that the next time a customer walked in, she already knew what they drank without having to ask. But when you worked the night shift long enough, that habit became something else. It became a way of knowing which table was about to have trouble, which person was about to leave without paying, which man had been watching Kayla longer than he should. Marlene had once told her that in this line of work, your ears mattered even more than your hands. Chloe hadn't needed her to say it. She'd understood that a long time ago. The bar closed at 2 o'clock. Chloe wiped down the counter, counted the money, pulled down the metal shutter, then walked 3 blocks to the night bus stop. By the time she reached the 2-room apartment in Bridgeport, it was usually close to 4 in the morning. She took off her shoes at the door, because her mother was a light sleeper, set her bag on a chair, then lay down on the couch in the living room with her clothes still carrying the smell of the bar. She didn't go into the bedroom because the bedroom had already been given to her mother. She slept for 2.5 hours. At 7 o'clock, the alarm vibrated, and Chloe got up to make coffee for both of them, helped her mother into her coat, supported her down 3 flights of stairs in a bit safe, then took the bus with her to the dialysis center. 3 sessions a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. It had been that way for 4 years. Susan Callahan was 56, and she always said it didn't hurt. But Chloe knew she was lying because every time she sat down in that chair, she gripped the armrest tightly before the needle went in. 4 hours lying there while her blood flowed out of her body, through a machine, and then back into her again. Chloe sat in the waiting area with her head resting against the wall, drifting in and out of shallow sleep. And when her mother came out, she helped her home again, cooked her something to eat, then went back to work the night shift that afternoon. And so it went, week after week. She didn't complain to anyone, because she didn't see anything to complain about. This was her mother. There was no second option. Susan often told her that she ought to think about herself once in a while, that she was 27 already, that at her age, Her friends were building careers instead of counting dialysis appointments on a calendar hanging on the wall. Chloe always gave her the same answer. "I'm fine, Mom." And Susan always fell silent after that, because she knew her daughter was lying, just as Chloe knew her mother was lying when she said it didn't hurt. The two of them held on to those small lies like an agreement between them, because speaking the truth wouldn't change anything, and it would only make them both cry. The name Callahan was still on the mailbox, and beneath it there was the word Tom, almost completely worn away. Her father's name, written in marker 11 years earlier. No one in the apartment spoke that name anymore. 11 years was long enough for a name to become something people stepped past every day without stopping. 9 days before that night, just after Chloe had helped her mother home and was folding Susan's coat, her phone vibrated. It was the hospital. The woman on the other end spoke in the carefully controlled voice of someone trained to remain calm, and she called Chloe Miss Callahan 3 times in the first 2 sentences. That was the first sign that something bad was coming. She said Susan Callahan's file had been reviewed during that quarter's financial audit. She said the outstanding balance had exceeded the program's permitted threshold. She said she was very sorry to inform her that, as of that morning, the patient had been placed on temporary hold on the kidney transplant waiting list. Chloe asked only one question: "What does temporary hold mean?" The woman explained that it meant Mrs. Callahan would remain in the system, but she wouldn't be considered if a compatible organ became available until her financial status was restored. Chloe asked how much they needed. $41,000, within 30 days. After 30 days, the file would be removed completely, and the patient would have to register again from the beginning, which meant losing every year she had already spent waiting. Chloe said thank you, then ended the call. She stood in the kitchen with her mother's coat still in her hands, and she didn't move for nearly a minute. From the bedroom, Susan called out and asked who it was. Chloe answered that it was only the bar asking whether she could switch shifts. Then she hung the coat on its hook, turned on the faucet, and washed 2 cups that were already clean. The next night, Gala was the first one to notice. She was standing at the end of the bar folding towels when her hands suddenly stopped. She stared at the screen of her phone, then looked up at Chloe with an expression Chloe had never seen on her face before. Gala tried to hide it, but it was already too late. Chloe held out her hand. On the screen was the city's social media news page, under the weekend events section, and the photograph, taking up nearly half the page, showed Ethan Brooks standing beside Vivian Ashford, his hand resting on her waist, both of them smiling toward the camera. Beneath it was a bold headline calling it the engagement of the year. Ethan was 31, Deputy Director of Project Development at Ashford Group. Vivian was 28, the only daughter of Richard Ashford. Chloe read the entire article. She read the comments too. Then she handed the phone back to Gala and told her to go wipe down the tables in the back. She said nothing else. 4 years. She had paid the rent for 4 years while Ethan went to graduate school at night. She had worked the night shift so he could get enough sleep before his interviews. 3 months earlier, he had disappeared with a 7-word text message, and she had told herself that maybe he simply needed time. Now she knew what he had needed. Close to 1 o'clock in the morning, when only a handful of customers were left in the bar, Ethan walked in through the front door. He didn't sit down. He stood at the bar, pulled out a check, placed it face down on the wooden counter, and pushed it toward her. $5,000. He said it was for her to disappear quietly, that a lot of important people would be attending the wedding, and that he didn't want any surprises. Chloe looked at the check for a very long time. She asked whether he had ever intended to tell her, or whether he had simply planned to let her find out online, like everyone else. Ethan shrugged and said there wouldn't have been any point in telling her. Chloe asked what those 4 years had been, and he answered in the calm voice of a man explaining something obvious. "You didn't lose anything, Chloe. You just stopped being useful." Chloe picked up the check, tore it in half, then tore both halves again, and placed the 4 pieces of paper on the counter in front of him. Ethan didn't pick them up. He only told her that she'd regret it, then turned and walked out. Marlene had stood at the far end of the bar through the entire conversation, still holding a cleaning cloth in one hand, and she didn't say a word until the door closed behind him. Then she asked Chloe only one thing. Did she want to go home early? Chloe said no. The following night, Vivian Ashford came in. She walked through the door at 11 o'clock at night, with 3 women about her own age. She hadn't made a reservation. She didn't ask for anyone. She walked straight to the bar and sat down on the stool directly in front of Chloe. She didn't order a drink. Instead, she picked up an empty glass from the counter and tapped its base against the wood 3 times, slowly, until everyone in the bar turned to look. Only then did she speak, and her voice was perfectly ordinary, almost friendly. She said she'd heard a great deal about Chloe. She said she'd wanted to see her with her own eyes. Then she placed a stiff, cream-colored invitation with gold lettering on the counter and pushed it toward Chloe with 2 fingers. 300 guests. Saturday night, the Ashford estate. She said she wanted Chloe there. One of the 3 women with her laughed, then immediately fell silent when Vivian didn't laugh with her. Chloe didn't touch the invitation. Vivian reached behind the stool to where a spare apron hung from a hook, took it down, and threw it straight at Chloe's chest. She said that was Chloe's evening gown. She told her to wear it exactly like that, not to change a thing, because she wanted all 300 people in that room to see with their own eyes the kind of woman her future husband had once been forced to live off. Chloe caught the apron before it fell to the floor. She stood perfectly still, holding it in both hands, and said nothing. Vivian leaned forward, rested her elbows on the bar, and lowered her voice. She said she knew Chloe was thinking about not coming. She said her father owned the building. She told Chloe to go ahead and imagine what would happen to this bar, to the silver-haired woman standing at the far end of the counter, to the young girl whose hands were shaking at table number 4, if the seat Vivian had already reserved for Saturday night remained empty. Then she sat upright again and waited. Chloe folded the apron. She folded it in half, then folded it into quarters, neatly, as though she were about to put it away in a drawer. She placed it on the counter beside the invitation. Then she said exactly 1 sentence. "I'll be there." Vivian looked at her for a few more seconds, gave a single nod, then stood and walked out with her 3 friends. None of them paid anything because none of them had ordered anything. There were 17 people in the bar that night. 17 people had heard every word from beginning to end. Not one of them said a thing. 2 days later, an email arrived in the Coral Room's inbox. A client had booked beverage service for a private event on Thursday afternoon at an address on Oak Street, paid the full amount in advance, and offered a fee 3 times the normal rate. In the notes section, there was one line specifically naming the server the client wanted present. Marlene read that line twice before handing the computer to Chloe. She said she was going to refuse. Chloe asked how much the rent would go up the following month if she did. Marlene couldn't answer. She stood there for a while, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter, then said she was sorry, and Chloe told her she had nothing to apologize for. On Thursday afternoon, Chloe arrived at the Oak Street address, wearing her bar uniform. Inside, Vivian was having a private gathering with several friends. There was wine, and there were people from a dressmaker's shop preparing clothes for Saturday night. Chloe was shown where to stand in the corner of the room and told to pour drinks. She worked in silence for nearly an hour. No one spoke to her until Vivian called her name. The seamstress was struggling with the hem of the dress and needed another person to help pin it. Vivian said Chloe looked free. Chloe set down her tray, walked over, lowered herself onto one knee, and began pinning exactly as the seamstress instructed. She worked carefully because Chloe did everything carefully. There were 7 people in the room, and 3 of them took out their phones. Vivian stood still on the low platform, holding a full glass of red wine in one hand, looking down at the top of Chloe's head. She asked how long Chloe had worked at that bar. Chloe said 6 years. Vivian asked whether she planned to do it forever. Chloe didn't answer. Then Vivian tilted her wrist. The wine poured out in a stream, running through Chloe's hair, down the back of her neck, over the shoulders of her white shirt, spreading across her back in a dark stain, and continuing to drip onto the floor. Chloe didn't stand up. She didn't flinch away. She remained exactly where she was, still kneeling, still holding the pin between her fingers, and she finished pinning the last section of the hem. Vivian looked at the empty glass in her hand and said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I suppose my hand is shaking because I'm nervous." No one laughed. The seamstress bent down to pick up a spool of thread from the floor and stayed down there longer than necessary. 2 women sitting on the couch turned their faces toward the window. A man standing near the drinks table suddenly found something on his phone that needed checking. Only one of Vivian's friends didn't look away. She held up her phone and recorded the entire thing from beginning to end. Chloe rose, picked up her tray, and asked whether anyone needed anything else. No one ordered another drink. She walked into the small kitchen at the back, used paper towels to blot some of the liquid from her shoulder, then returned to the exact place where she'd been standing, and remained there until the gathering was over. The video was posted that same night. It didn't spread beyond their circle. It simply moved through a very small private group made up of people who would be there on Saturday night. And beneath the video was a single line that several people would repeat later. "Special entertainment Saturday night. Don't be late." Not one person in that group wrote a single word of protest. Someone reacted with a laughing emoji. Someone else asked what time it would begin. Chloe got home close to 9 o'clock that night. She took off her shoes at the door, walked straight into the bathroom, turned on the water, and stood beneath the shower for a long time. For the first few minutes, the water running down around her feet was pale pink, then slowly became clear. She washed her hair twice. She washed her uniform shirt by hand in the sink, scrubbing the shoulder again and again, but the stain kept its shape, and eventually she wrung the shirt out, hung it on a hook, and stopped trying. She didn't cry. She stood in front of the mirror for a while, wiped her face, then went into the kitchen and reheated a pot of soup for her mother. Susan was sitting at the dining table, her hand trembling slightly as she held her spoon, and she asked why Chloe had come home so late. Chloe said the bar had been busy. Susan looked at her daughter's still damp hair, then at the shirt hanging in the bathroom through the partially open door, and asked if she was all right. Chloe said, "I'm fine, Mom." Susan nodded and ate 2 more spoonfuls of soup. Then she set the spoon down. She said she remembered when Chloe was little, there had been a time when another child at school took her coat, and Chloe walked all the way home in the middle of winter without telling anyone a word. Susan hadn't found out until 3 days later. She said your father always used to say you were just like him. She stopped there, as though there were another half to the sentence that she either didn't want to say or couldn't remember how to say. Chloe didn't ask. She stood up, carried her mother's bowl to the sink, turned on the faucet, and washed 2 cups that were already clean. That night, Chloe couldn't sleep. She lay on the couch in the living room, listening to the steady sound of her mother's breathing coming from the bedroom, while the number 41,000 kept running through her mind again and again. She had already calculated everything. Selling the old car would bring in 3,000. Emptying her entire savings account would give her a little over 2,000. Borrowing from Marlene wasn't an option, because Marlene didn't have anything to lend. Close to 4 o'clock in the morning, Chloe sat up, turned on the table lamp, and opened the bottom drawer of the nightstand her mother no longer used. Inside were old documents, a photo album, and hospital bills stacked according to year. And at the very bottom, tucked between 2 layers of cardboard, was a card. It was made of metal, matte black, heavier than it looked. There was no name, no logo, no title, only 10 digits stamped into the center, their raised edges noticeable beneath her fingertips. Chloe held it in her hand, and the night 3 years earlier came back to her whole. It had been raining hard that night. The bar had been closed for half an hour, and she was the only one still there counting the money because Marlene had gone home early with a cold. Chloe heard the back door swing open, and when she turned around, a man was standing there, with one hand pressed tightly against his left side, soaked through, his face drained of color. He didn't say anything. He only looked at her. Chloe had exactly 2 seconds to decide. She could have screamed. She could have run for the front door. She could have dialed 3 digits. She did none of those things. She went to the front door, locked it, pulled down the curtain, then came back, took his arm, and helped him into the storage room. She moved 2 beer crates aside to make a place for him to sit. She took the first aid kit from the wall, tore open a packet of clean cloths, and pressed hard against the place where his hand had been. She told him to move his hand. He moved it. She pressed the cloth down and kept it there. She counted silently in her head to keep the rhythm of her hands steady. He breathed very slowly, very evenly, like a man trying not to reveal anything. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask what had happened. She didn't ask whether he needed her to call anyone. She simply changed the cloth whenever it became soaked through and started again. Nearly an hour later, the bleeding stopped. She bandaged him, handed him a bottle of water, then sat down on the floor with her back against the shelving, both hands trembling violently now that there was nothing left for them to do. He watched her shake and said nothing about it. He stood, pulled a stack of money from inside his jacket, and placed it on top of a beer crate. Chloe looked at the money, then pushed it back toward him. She said paying for the glass of whiskey earlier was enough. He stood very still for a long time after that. Then he took the money back and put it away, and in its place, he set down a black card. He said that one day she would need something done. Just one thing. He told her to call that number. Then he added 4 final words before stepping out through the back door, and the way he said them didn't sound like gratitude. It sounded like a term in an agreement. I always keep my word. 3 years passed, and Chloe never once took that card out of the drawer. But the next morning, after bringing her mother home from dialysis, she sat down at the old computer and began searching. She didn't have a name. All she had was a date and a bar in Bridgeport. She searched for incidents that had happened around that neighborhood on that rainy night. She searched the news from that week, then from that month. It took nearly 2 days, and she didn't find him through a news report. She found him in a photograph from a funeral that had been published alongside an article about a federal trial. 3 men stood beside one another in the picture, and the man in the middle was the man who had sat on a beer crate in the storage room of her bar. The caption beneath the photograph gave his name, Donatello Vaccaro. She kept reading, 38 years old. She read what the newspapers had written about the family that carried that name, about the port, about the Longshoremen's Union, about trials that ended without anyone being convicted. She read until her hands went cold. She remembered locking the front door. She remembered reaching out to support his arm without asking a single question. For 3 years, she had thought of that night as a decent thing she'd done for a stranger in trouble. Now she sat in front of the screen and understood that on that night, she had stood close to the kind of thing people spent their entire lives trying to stay away from. She closed the computer. She picked up the black card, turned it over once in her hand, then put it back into the bottom drawer, tucked between the 2 layers of cardboard exactly as before, and pushed the drawer shut. She told herself that there were doors which, once opened, could never truly be closed again, and that no matter what happened, she would never call that number. On Wednesday morning, everything came crashing down in the span of a single day. Chloe was sitting in the waiting area when she heard an alarm from the dialysis unit, and when she ran inside, 3 people were already surrounding her mother's chair. Susan was unconscious, her head tilted to one side, her arms still connected to the tubing. They shut off the machine, lowered the chair, and one of them pushed Chloe out of the way. Susan regained consciousness 4 minutes later. When Chloe was finally allowed back in, her mother was trying to smile, saying she'd only gotten lightheaded and that Chloe shouldn't make such a fuss. But the doctor pulled Chloe into the hallway and spoke to her in the blunt tone doctors only used when they no longer had any reason to soften the truth. He said her mother's body was no longer responding well to dialysis. He said every session now was a gamble. He said that without a transplant, she had a few months at most. And he emphasized the words at most. Chloe asked how many months a few months meant. He said he didn't know. And it was the most honest answer she'd received in 4 years. That afternoon, when Chloe arrived at the bar earlier than usual, Kayla was sitting on the back steps with red eyes. She said someone from the building management company had come by that morning. She said they'd handed Marlene a document and told her that her management contract would be terminated at the end of the month at the request of the property owner. She said Marlene had read the paper 3 times, folded it, slipped it into her coat pocket, then gone into the kitchen to wash dishes, and she'd washed for 40 minutes even though there hadn't been a single dirty dish. Chloe asked whether Marlene had said anything. Kayla shook her head. Chloe went inside, and Marlene was standing at the end of the bar checking inventory as she did every afternoon. She looked up, greeted Chloe, and asked how her mother was doing that day. She didn't say a single word about the paper in her pocket. 20 years she'd stood in that place, and she'd chosen not to tell Chloe because she knew that if she did, Chloe would blame herself. That was what made Chloe feel as though she couldn't breathe. Close to 10 o'clock that night, her phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. The message contained only 3 lines. 3 days left. I've already reserved your table, beside the kitchen door, where everyone can see you. Chloe read it, locked the screen, slipped the phone into her apron pocket, and kept working until 2 o'clock in the morning. She wiped down the bar, counted the money, pulled down the metal shutter, and walked 3 blocks to the night bus stop just as she always did. There were only 4 people on the bus. Chloe sat in the last row, stared out through the window, and began counting the things she still had left to lose. She had no other job. She had no savings. She had no degree, no one to call, no backup plan. No one could take from her something she'd already lost. But Marlene had a bar, and 20 years of her life behind it. Kayla had the first job she'd ever had, and a mother waiting at home. And Susan had a few months, at most a few months. That was what Chloe couldn't bear. Not having wine poured over her head, not having an apron thrown against her chest in front of 17 people. It was the fact that the kindest people she knew were being dragged down with her, and they were still staying silent so she wouldn't have one more burden to carry. The bus stopped in Bridgeport. Chloe didn't get off right away. She stayed in her seat for another 2 minutes, until the driver looked at her through the mirror. Then she went home, took off her shoes at the door, and walked straight into the bedroom. Susan was asleep. Chloe pulled open the bottom drawer, slid her hand between the 2 layers of cardboard, and took out the black card. She sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness, holding it in her hand for a very long time. She thought about the door she'd locked 3 years earlier, and the promise she'd made to herself that she would never call. She thought that if she did, she would be crossing a line she might never be able to cross back over. Then she looked at her mother's face, resting against the pillow, listened to the heaviness of her breathing, and understood that the only thing that had stopped her for 3 years was her own fear, and her own fear no longer mattered. She stepped into the hallway, leaned against the wall, and dialed the 10 digits. The phone rang exactly twice. There was no sound of anyone clearing his throat, No voice asking who it was. There was only a man's low, unhurried voice, as though he'd already been holding the phone in his hand and had been waiting for 3 years. "It's been 3 years, Miss Callahan. I thought you'd forgotten." The address arrived 10 minutes later, with no greeting, no time, only the name of a street and a house number. Chloe got there close to 3 o'clock in the morning. It was an Italian restaurant on Taylor Street that had been closed for a long time, with the chairs turned upside down on the tables, and only a single light still burning at the far end of the room. A man around 45 stood blocking the doorway, looked her over from head to toe, then stepped aside, without saying a word. She would later learn that his name was Marco Bellini. Donatello Vaccaro sat alone at the only table that hadn't been cleared, halfway through a plate of pasta, and he didn't look up when she walked in. Chloe went straight to the table. She didn't pull out a chair. She took a sheet of paper, folded into quarters from her coat pocket, and placed it on the tabletop, about a handspan from his plate. She said, "I'm not here to beg." Donatello set down his fork. He didn't look at the paper. He looked at her. Chloe said there was an engagement party in Lake Forest this Saturday night, 300 guests, and she'd been invited there to be made into a joke. She said she needed him to walk into that room with her on his arm. One time, he wouldn't have to say anything to anyone, wouldn't have to stay longer than 15 minutes, and afterward, she would disappear from his life and never use the card again. Donatello asked whether she was making him an offer or making a demand. Chloe said she was making a trade. One of his eyebrows lifted slightly, the only expression his face had shown since she entered. Chloe said that 3 weeks earlier, a man had sat at table number 9 in her bar. He drank 2 glasses of Macallan, stayed from 9:30 until nearly 11 o'clock, and he was sitting with another man. The second man worked for him. Donatello said nothing. Chloe continued. She said she'd been standing about 13 feet away, that she'd poured all 4 drinks for them, and that she remembered almost everything they'd said to each other. She said that was what she had to trade. Donatello asked whether she knew who she was bargaining with. Chloe said yes. He asked how long she'd known. She said 2 days, then added that if she'd known sooner, she wouldn't have opened the storage room door for him 3 years ago. It was the only sentence in the entire conversation that made the corner of his mouth move. Then he pushed the chair across from him out with the toe of his shoe. He said, "Then sit down." Chloe sat. She told him what she'd heard. She said the man at table number 9 had talked about a pool of capital that needed to be finalized before the end of the quarter, that 2 parcels near the port were being held up, and that he had repeated the same sentence 3 times. He doesn't need to know about this, and Donatello's man hadn't objected to it once. She said they'd mentioned a 7-figure number and a set of initials. She said that when the man at table number 9 left, he'd tipped $20 and hadn't looked at her face. Donatello listened without interrupting her once. Then he asked for the man's name. Chloe said she didn't know. She said he hadn't handed over a card. He'd paid in cash, and no one had used his name the entire night. Donatello asked what she did remember. Chloe said she remembered his voice. She said she remembered the way he held his glass. And she said she remembered one thing in particular, that when he referred to Donatello, he hadn't called him Mr. Vaccaro. He'd used his first name. She said she remembered that detail because it was the only moment all night when Donatello's man had stopped talking, and he'd stayed silent for quite a while. Donatello didn't say anything. He picked up his water glass, took a sip, then set it down. He looked toward the door where Marco was standing, and his gaze stayed there longer than it needed to. Chloe waited. She waited for him to ask another question, waited for him to ask her to describe the man's face, waited for him to get angry, waited for anything. But he didn't ask another thing. He simply looked back at her and changed the subject, as though the last 10 seconds had never happened. He asked how old her mother was. Chloe froze. She asked how he knew her mother was sick. Donatello said people didn't call that number at 3 o'clock in the morning because of a party. Chloe said 56. He asked how long it had been. She said 4 years. He gave one small nod and left it at that. Then he said he'd give her an answer tomorrow, that she should go home and sleep, and that Marco would drive her back. Chloe said she could take the bus. Donatello said not at 3 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't an offer, and it wasn't an order. It was simply the way a person stated something they considered too obvious to require further discussion. Chloe stood. At the door, she turned back and asked him one question. She asked why he hadn't said yes and hadn't said no. Donatello remained exactly where he was, beneath the only light still burning, and he said he hadn't decided yet how much she was worth. The answer came the following afternoon. Marco parked in front of the house and said only that he wanted to see her. It was the same old restaurant on Taylor Street, the same single light burning inside. But this time, there was no plate on the table, only a small notebook lying face down. Donatello told her to sit. Then he said he'd thought about it, and he wasn't going to do what she'd asked. Chloe hadn't even had time to react before he continued. He said he was going to do more than that, and because of that, the terms would be different. He laid them out one by one, slowly, like a man reciting a contract from memory. First, it wouldn't be one night. It would be 30 days. Chloe asked what the 30 days were for. He said because if he walked into that room with her and disappeared the next day, then by Monday everyone would understand it had only been an act, and everything would come crashing back down on her twice as hard. He said what she needed wasn't one evening. What she needed was for the people in that room to believe it was real. Second, during those 30 days, whenever he asked, she would appear beside him in public. Not often, but often enough for people to see. Third, she wouldn't ask about his business. Not one question. Not because he was hiding it, but because there were things that, once you knew them, you could never go back to being someone who didn't know. Fourth, and he paused before saying this one, she wasn't allowed to lie to him. He said no matter what it was, no matter how bad it was, no matter what she thought it would make him think of her, one lie and it was over. He wouldn't ask again, wouldn't give her a chance to explain, and there would be no second time. Chloe said she understood. He said she didn't yet, but she would. Fifth, he said he would cover every expense related to her mother's treatment, including the $41,000. Chloe stood up. She said no. She said, I came here to trade information for one night. I'm not selling myself. She said, if you pay my mother's hospital bills, then what are those 30 days? What am I during those 30 days? Donatello remained seated. He didn't raise his voice, and he didn't offer a long explanation. He only said, I'm not buying you. I'm paying a debt. Chloe said, you don't owe me anything. He said 3 years ago, you had 2 seconds to decide, and by every ordinary measure in this world, you made the wrong decision. And I'm still sitting here because you made the wrong decision. He said, I promised you one thing. You've only asked for half of it. The other half belongs to me, not to you. And you don't get to refuse someone else's debt. Chloe stood there for a long time. Then she sat down. No papers were signed. There were no witnesses. Donatello simply extended his hand across the table, and Chloe took it. His hand was dry and cold, and the handshake lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then it was over. He said Marco would contact her tomorrow. After she left, Donatello opened the notebook on the table. Inside was a printed sheet he'd requested the night before, a list of customers who had paid by card at the Coral Room over the previous 3 weeks, cross-checked against a roster of middle management employees at a real estate corporation. The man at table number 9 had paid cash, exactly as she'd said, but the man sitting across from him at that same table hadn't, and that man was his assistant. The name surfaced after 4 hours. Ethan Brooks, Deputy Director of Project Development, Ashford Group. Donatello stared at the name for a very long time. He'd never met Ethan Brooks. He'd never done business with Ashford Group. But someone in his own organization had sat drinking with an Ashford man for an hour and a half, and that person had never reported a single word of it. And that same person, according to the woman who had just walked out of the restaurant, had allowed Donatello's first name to be used without correcting him. Donatello closed the notebook. He sat alone beneath the light for several more minutes, recalculating everything from the beginning, and he didn't like the number he arrived at. Then he called Marco in. He said she would continue working her night shifts as usual. She wasn't to know. No one else in the organization was to know either, including the people Marco normally reported to. Marco asked what was going on. Donatello didn't answer that question. He only said, from today on, every time she leaves her home, I want to know. On Friday afternoon, Marco picked her up at the end of the alley and drove her to a townhouse on the north side of the city. 2 people were already waiting in the living room, a middle-aged woman from a dressmaker's shop and a man carrying a case of tools. The dress was already hanging on a rack. It hadn't been made new. The woman said it came from a collection 4 years earlier, that only 3 of them existed in the world, and that her job that afternoon was to alter it to fit Chloe, not to cut it apart and remake it. She measured, pinned, and worked in silence for 2 hours. Chloe stood still and let them do what they needed to do, and she didn't ask any questions. When they were almost finished, Donatello came in carrying a small, old wooden box, its edges worn smooth with age. He placed it on the table and opened the lid. Inside was a set of stones arranged on fabric that had faded with time. He pushed the box toward the man with the tool case and told him to set them across the bodice and shoulders. The man looked into the box, then lifted his eyes to Donatello and asked very quietly if he was sure. Donatello said, I'm sure. Chloe looked at the box. She asked who they belonged to. Donatello said, my mother. He said she'd worn them only once, and then put them away. He said she'd told him they were too heavy. Then he closed the lid and said nothing more about it. Chloe asked how much the set was worth. No one answered. The woman from the dressmaker's shop lowered her head and continued pinning. The man opened his tool case and began laying out needles and thread. Marco stood by the door, looking out toward the street. Chloe asked again, and this time Donatello told her not to ask that question anymore, because no one in the room was going to answer her. She asked why. He said because if she knew the number, she'd walk differently. He said tomorrow she needed to walk as though she had no idea what she was wearing. It was close to 8 o'clock that evening when they finished. The tailor and the woman from the dressmaker's shop left. Chloe went into the kitchen to get some water, and she stopped in the doorway. Donatello was standing at the sink, with his sleeves rolled up, washing the glasses everyone had just used. He washed them one at a time, slowly and carefully, then placed each one upside down on the rack. Chloe stood there watching him for quite a while. She said, "I thought you had people to do that." Donatello didn't turn around. He said, "There are some things I don't want other people doing for me." He finished washing the last glass, dried his hands, and only then turned to look at her. Chloe said, "I have one question I want to ask, and you told me I'm not allowed to ask about your business, but this isn't about your business." He said, "Go ahead." She asked why he was doing this. She said, "You could give me $41,000 and call the debt settled, and I wouldn't complain. You don't need to walk into a party in Lake Forest. You don't need 30 days. You don't need to open that box." Donatello leaned back against the edge of the sink, folded his arms, and looked at her for a while before answering. He said, "Because 3 years ago, you didn't ask me that question." Chloe didn't understand at first. He said, "That night you could have asked who I was, where I came from, what I'd done to end up like that, and if you'd asked, I wouldn't have blamed you. But you didn't. You just pressed the cloth down and kept your hand there for an hour." He said, "In my life, the number of people who've treated me without first calculating what use I might be to them can be counted on fewer than the fingers of one hand." Then he said, "That's enough. It's late." And he didn't say anything more about it. Before Marco drove her home, Donatello handed Chloe a small phone, a cheap one, still sealed in its box. He said there was only one number saved in it. He told her to keep it on her person tomorrow night. Not in her handbag, but on her. Chloe asked what it was for. He said if anything happened tomorrow night, she wouldn't need to say anything at all, wouldn't need to explain, wouldn't need to tell him what was happening. He said all she had to do was press call. No one helped her up. 300 people stood around her, including people who had eaten dinner in her home dozens of times, and not one of them stepped forward. The first person who did was the very woman Vivian had spent an entire week preparing to humiliate. Chloe slipped her hand from Donatello's arm, crossed the open stretch of floor, and lowered herself onto one knee beside Vivian. She held out her hand. She didn't say a word. Vivian looked up, her eyes already blurred with tears, and for one brief moment, perhaps she meant to take it. Then she saw the 300 faces watching her, and she slapped the hand away. She struck it hard enough that Chloe had to brace one palm against the floor to keep from falling. Chloe stood, brushed off her hand, and took one step back. She didn't say a single word. Donatello didn't go to Vivian. He moved around the crowd slowly, and people parted for him on their own like water opening before something that couldn't be stopped. He walked straight to the small table beside the kitchen door. He picked up the place card lying there, read the words printed on its face, folded it in half, and slipped it into the breast pocket of his jacket. Only then did he turn and look at the entire room. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke at the volume of a man talking across a family dinner table, and because of that, 300 people had to hold their breath to hear him. He said, "I heard there was supposed to be special entertainment tonight." No one answered. Someone lowered a glass onto a table as quietly as possible. Donatello extended his hand toward Chloe, and she stepped forward to stand beside him. He said, "This is Chloe Callahan." Then he paused long enough for the name to travel through the entire room. He said, "From this moment on, anyone who touches her touches me." That was all he said. No specific threat, no finger pointed at anyone, no stare held too long on a single face. But near the back row, an older man quietly placed a hand on his wife's shoulder and drew her half a step backward. Richard Ashford was still standing beside his overturned chair, and he didn't pick it up. Ethan stood about 13 feet away, his face drained white, his hands still wet with wine, staring at Chloe as though he were trying to solve an equation whose answer no longer made sense. Then Vivian laughed. It was a short, dry sound that came from where she was still sitting on the floor. She said, 8 years. No one understood what she meant. She pushed herself upright, swept the hair from her face, and said it again, louder this time. 8 years. She looked straight at Donatello and said, "I wrote to you for 8 years. She said, "I started when I was 20, After that night at your family's restaurant, the night you were the only man in the room who stood up and pulled out a chair for me, she said, "Do you think I don't know you never read them?" She said, "My father sat across from you in his office and asked you to marry me, and you said no. You said one word, no, then stood up and walked out. And my father had to sit alone in that room for 2 hours afterward." Her voice broke in the middle of the sentence. She said, "I accepted it. I accepted that you didn't want anyone, that you belonged to no one. I told myself that for 8 years, because it was the only way I could live with it." Then she pointed at Chloe and screamed, "And then you walk in here with some little bar girl who pours drinks for a living." The entire ballroom went completely silent. 300 people had just watched the Ashford daughter destroy with her own hands everything she had left. Ethan didn't look at Vivian. He looked down at the floor, and everyone understood that he'd just heard the full truth about the marriage he was about to enter. Richard Ashford stepped forward, took his daughter by the elbow, and said something into her ear in a very low voice. Vivian jerked her arm away, but she didn't say anything else. Donatello looked at her for several seconds. There was no pity on his face, and no contempt either. He simply looked at her as though he were looking at something that had ended a long time ago. Then he said one sentence, and he said it to her, not to the room. He said, "Miss Ashford, I never read a single one of your letters, and that was the only kindness I could offer you." Then he turned to Chloe. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He simply held out his arm. Chloe placed her hand there again, and together they walked through the entire ballroom and out onto the front steps, while behind them, the music never started again. They hadn't even made it to the car when Richard Ashford caught up with them. He didn't raise his voice. He simply asked Donatello to give him 5 minutes, then led the way into the study in the east wing. The door closed behind them. Ashford didn't offer him a seat. He poured himself a drink and began to speak. And he spoke in the voice of a man who had sat at the head of the table for 30 years. He said he understood that what had happened tonight was a performance, that everyone had moments when they felt the need to prove something, and that he was prepared to let it pass. Then his tone changed. He said the Southern Port had 4 permits coming up for renewal that quarter. He said he sat on the board with 2 people who had influence over those decisions. He said 3 banks were extending lines of credit to transportation companies carrying the Vaccaro name, and that he had lunch every month with 2 of those 3 banks. He said labor inspectors, fire inspectors, tax inspectors. They were slow machines, but once they started moving, no one could shut them off. He said, "I'm not threatening you. I'm only describing the weather." Donatello stood there and listened from beginning to end, his hands resting quietly at his sides, never interrupting once. When Ashford finally stopped speaking and took his first sip of the drink, Donatello spoke. He said, "You have 14 days. Ashford waited for the rest of the sentence. There was no rest. Donatello opened the door and walked out. Ashford remained alone in the study, with the glass in his hand, and he didn't call after him to ask what the 14 days were for, because even he didn't want to hear the answer. In the west hallway, Ethan stopped Chloe. He stepped directly into her path and said her name twice, before he managed to say anything else. He said, "Listen to me first." He said he hadn't known she would come like this. He said the check that night had been Vivian's father's idea, not his. He said he'd been wrong. He said those 4 years had been real, at least on his side. Chloe stood still and listened. When he saw that her expression didn't change, Ethan's voice began to change instead. He said, "Do you even know who you're standing beside?" He said that man never saved anyone, that he only used people and threw them away, and that when he got tired of her, she would end up right back at that bar, except by then no one would dare hire her anymore. He said he was telling her this because he still cared about her. Chloe looked at him for a while. Then she said, "You're right. He doesn't save anyone. He just keeps his promises. You never knew what that meant." Then she stepped around him and kept walking, and Ethan didn't follow. On the drive home, Marco was behind the wheel, and Donatello sat beside her in the back seat. Chloe reached for the seatbelt, but her hand was shaking so badly that the buckle slipped past the latch 3 times in a row. She tried a 4th time and still couldn't get it in. Donatello said nothing. He leaned toward her, took the buckle from her hand, pressed it into the latch until it clicked, then leaned back and sat straight again. He didn't touch her hand any longer than necessary. The car had gone several blocks when Chloe began to cry. There was no sound, only the trembling of her shoulders. She didn't understand why. She had expected to feel satisfaction. She had imagined that when she watched those 300 people fall silent, something inside her would finally feel lighter. But nothing felt lighter. Her mother was still on the waiting list. Marlene still had that paper in her coat pocket. Kayla's hands still shook when she carried a tray. And Chloe had just worn something whose value she didn't know, was sitting in a car that didn't belong to her, on her way back to a third-floor apartment in a building with no elevator. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. Then she asked him a question she hadn't meant to ask. She asked whether he ever got tired. Donatello didn't answer right away. He looked out through the window, and the silence lasted long enough for Chloe to think he wasn't going to answer at all. The car turned onto her street. Then he said, "Every day." The first blow came on Monday morning. A team of inspectors arrived at the Coral Room at 10 o'clock. 3 people with every document in order, and they stayed for 4 hours. On Wednesday, they came back. On Friday, they came for the 3rd time, and this time, someone from the licensing department was with them. The report listed 11 violations, most of them things every bar in that neighborhood was guilty of and no one had ever been cited for before. That afternoon, the liquor license was suspended. Without alcohol, the Coral Room was nothing anymore. Marlene called every employee and told them to take some time off, her voice as ordinary as though she were only announcing a shift change. On Saturday, the building management company sent someone down to collect the keys. Marlene stood outside the bar with a cardboard box in her arms holding a few personal belongings, and she remained there for a long time after they had gone. For 20 years, she had opened that door at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and pulled it shut at 2 o'clock in the morning. She didn't cry. She only stood there looking at the darkened sign, then tucked the box against her hip and started walking toward the bus stop. By the time Chloe arrived, all she could see was Marlene's back at the far end of the street, and she didn't call after her because she had no idea what she could possibly say. The 3rd blow came on Sunday night. Kayla called Chloe from the train station, breathing hard, and it took her a while before she could form a complete sentence. She said there had been 2 men waiting on the platform. They hadn't touched her. They hadn't blocked her way. One of them had simply said her mother's full name, including her middle name, then recited the address of the apartment where the 2 of them lived, the building number, the floor, even the landlord's name. Then both men walked away. "That was all," Kayla said. "I don't understand. I didn't do anything. Why me?" Chloe told her to stay exactly where she was, somewhere crowded, then called a taxi and had it take Kayla all the way to her front door. During the entire ride, Kayla sat in silence with both hands wrapped tightly around the bag in her lap, and Chloe sat beside her without daring to look over. The final blow came the following Monday morning. Chloe brought her mother to the dialysis center as usual, and was told that Susan Callahan had been transferred to another facility over the weekend as part of a treatment reassignment. Chloe asked who had made the decision. No one could tell her. She took 2 buses to the new facility, an older building farther away and more crowded, and there they told her that Susan's kidney transplant registration file wasn't showing up in the system. Chloe asked what wasn't showing up meant. They said it might have been misplaced during the transfer, that these things happened from time to time, that she could simply submit everything again from the beginning and wait for the application to be reviewed. Chloe asked how long starting over would take. They said it depended. She asked what happened to the 4 years her mother had already spent waiting. The person looked at her, then looked down at the computer screen, and said she should speak with the records department. Chloe walked out into the hallway. She went all the way down it, turned into the restroom at the end, locked herself inside a stall, and sat down. Then she broke apart. She cried in a way she hadn't allowed herself to cry in 11 years, without control, unable even to make a sound, both hands covering her mouth while her shoulders still convulsed in waves. She thought of Marlene carrying that cardboard box toward the bus stop. She thought of Kayla's hands clutching her bag in the taxi. She thought of her mother sitting out there in a strange room, asking, "Why are you taking so long, honey?" Every one of these people had stood beside her, and every one of them was now paying for it. Not one of them had blamed her with a single word, and that was the part she couldn't bear. She stayed inside that restroom stall for nearly 20 minutes. Then she washed her face, dried it, and reached into the inside pocket of her coat for the small phone she'd carried on her for the past 9 days. There was only one number in it. She pressed call. The phone rang once and a half. She opened her mouth but couldn't get a single word out. She stood there with one hand gripping the sink, and all that came through the phone was the sound of her own breathing, broken and rapid. The person on the other end didn't ask anything. No one said her name. No one asked what had happened. There was only one sentence, spoken very slowly. "Stay right there. Don't go anywhere." For the next 48 hours, there wasn't a sound. No one was threatened. No one was beaten. No car parked outside anyone's home. There was only paperwork. On Wednesday morning, an investment company no one in Bridgeport had ever heard of completed the purchase of the building on the street where the Coral Room stood, paying the full amount in a single transaction with no negotiation. That afternoon, The liquor license was reinstated after all 11 violations in the report were corrected and resubmitted through the proper process. That evening, a lawyer knocked on Marlene's door and handed her a stack of contracts. Marlene read the first page, then read it again. She turned to the second page, then went back to the first. By the fourth time through, she set the papers down on the table and asked the lawyer whether he had the wrong address. He said he didn't. In the contract, her name wasn't listed under shift manager. It was listed under owner of the operating business, for a term of 20 years, with fixed rent that couldn't be adjusted. Marlene asked who had done this. The lawyer said he'd only been authorized to deliver the documents. She sat down in a chair, still holding the contract in her hands, and remained there for a very long time. It was nearly midnight before she called Chloe, and the first thing she said wasn't a question. She said she'd stood behind that bar for 20 years, and no one had ever asked her what she wanted. Then she asked Chloe what kind of man the man from Saturday night was. Chloe said, "I don't know." It was the most truthful thing she'd been able to say all week. On Thursday morning, the hospital called Chloe. The woman on the other end said there had been an error during the transfer, that Susan Callahan's records had been found and fully restored, with every year of accumulated waiting time preserved, and that she would be transferred back to her original facility within the week. The woman apologized 3 times in 2 minutes. Chloe said thank you and ended the call, then sat motionless on the edge of the bed for a long time. No one called to take credit. Everything had simply been put back where it belonged, quietly, as though the previous week had never happened. That afternoon, Chloe went to the hospital to sign the paperwork again. While she was waiting, someone gave her a printed copy of her mother's payment history to review. 4 years condensed into more than a dozen pages. Chloe turned through them one by one. The first year, she recognized every line, every charge, every time she'd emptied her account. The second year was the same. Then she reached the third year, and she stopped. For all 12 months of that year, the payer column didn't show her name. It showed the same line repeated 12 times. Patient Assistance Fund, anonymous contribution. Chloe remembered that year. She remembered how surprised she'd been when the bills stopped arriving. She remembered someone in the financial office telling her that her mother qualified for assistance, and she'd believed it was luck. She carried the printout down to the records department and asked what kind of fund it was. Someone searched the system and told her it was a fund administered by the hospital but not created by the hospital, that it had been established about 2.5 years earlier, and that it had exactly 1 donor. Chloe asked for the name. They said they couldn't provide it. She asked where the fund was now. They said it had been closed a year earlier by resolution of the board during a review of discretionary assistance programs, and they showed her the final page of the minutes, the signature section. There were 4 signatures. The second signature from the top was Richard Ashford. Chloe stared at that name for a very long time. He hadn't known who she was. He hadn't even heard her name until the previous Saturday night. A year earlier, he'd sat in a conference room, crossed 1 line out of a budget, signed his name, then gone to lunch. He hadn't hated her, hadn't targeted her, hadn't even known that someone named Chloe Callahan existed in the world. And that stroke of a pen had taken away a year of her mother's medical expenses, pushed Chloe into $41,000 of debt, and driven her to dial the 10 digits stamped onto the black card hidden in the drawer. Standing in the middle of that hospital hallway, Chloe understood that some people didn't need to form your face to have the power to destroy your life. All they had to do was cross out 1 line to make a spreadsheet look cleaner. That night, Chloe went to Taylor Street. She placed the printed payment history on the table, opened it to the 3rd year, and asked him if it had been him. Donatello looked at the paper. He didn't pick it up. He didn't ask where she'd gotten it. He said yes. Chloe asked why he hadn't told her. She asked where he'd been for the past 3 years, why he'd paid her mother's bills without knocking on her door even once, why he'd let her believe it had been luck. Donatello waited until she finished. Then he said, "I owed you 1 thing. I paid in advance." Chloe asked, "Then what about the promise?" He said, "The promise was that when you needed something, you would call, and you hadn't called." Chloe stood there with 1 hand still resting on the paper, and she understood that for those entire 3 years, the only thing that had kept this man from stepping into her life was the fact that he'd promised to wait until she asked first. The bar reopened that Saturday, and before it could open, the storage room had to be cleared out. For 3 days, Chloe and Kayla carried out crates of spoiled beer and shelving whose legs had been eaten through by rot. On Monday afternoon, in the farthest corner, Chloe pulled out another box. It was smaller, heavier, sealed shut with tape that had yellowed and hardened so badly that she had to cut through it with a knife. She sat down on the floor and opened it. On top was a photograph. 7 men in reflective safety vests stood in a row in front of a half-finished construction site, and the fourth man from the left was her father. Chloe set it aside and took out what lay underneath. It was a scaffolding inspection report dated April 11th, 2014, bearing the signature of an engineer and the seal of an independent inspection company. On page 3, in the conclusion section, one sentence had been underlined in ballpoint pen. It recommended that all construction on the east section be halted until the anchoring system was replaced. Chloe read that sentence 3 times. Then she pulled out the next document. It was another inspection report. Same date, same construction site, same signature, but the conclusion was different. The second report stated that the anchoring system met requirements and recommended that construction continue according to schedule. In the lower corner was the official receipt stamp from the authorities. The second report was the one that had been submitted. The first had never left this box. Chloe placed the 2 documents side by side on the floor and stared at them for a very long time. Beneath them was a notebook in her father's handwriting, the letters large and slanted. Inside were the names of 3 inspectors, the dates he had met with them, and beside each name was a number. On the final page, he had written 7 words. I already told them. No one listened. Beneath the notebook were 7 identical sets of documents, each bearing the name of a different family. 7 agreements, 7 signatures, 7 payments. The fourth set carried the name Susan Callahan, $18,000. Clause 3 stated that the recipient agreed never to make a public statement, never to file a complaint, and never to cooperate with any investigation, permanently. The date of signature was 2 months after the funeral. Chloe remembered that summer. She remembered her mother suddenly paying 6 months of rent all at once and telling her that someone from her father's old company had helped them. Chloe had been 16, and she'd believed her. She called Marlene. Marlene arrived within 40 minutes, and when she saw the open box on the floor, she didn't ask a single question. She stood in the doorway for a while, then sat down on a plastic chair. She said, "Your father gave me this box 3 days before he died. He told me that if anything happened, I should keep it and wait until his little girl was old enough." Chloe asked why she hadn't given it to her. Marlene didn't answer right away. Then she said there was something else. She said 6 years earlier, when Chloe applied for the job, she'd recognized the last name the moment she held the application in her hands. She said, "I knew you were Tom Callahan's daughter before you even walked into the interview." Chloe looked up at her. "Marlene said I hired you because I owed your father, and I meant to tell you when you turned 25, then 26, then 27. She said, then I watched you grow up. I watched you come home from the night shift at 4 in the morning and get back up at 7 to take your mother to dialysis. I looked at you and thought that if I opened that box, you'd lose the rest of your life to it too." Then she said, "And I was a coward, Chloe. I was scared." Her voice broke on the last word. Chloe didn't say anything for a long time. Then she walked over to Marlene and rested a hand on her shoulder. She said, "You gave me somewhere to stand when no one else gave me anything at all." Then she said, "I'm not angry with you." Marlene cried, covering her face with both hands, and Chloe kept her hand on her shoulder until she stopped. That night, Chloe sat alone in the storage room with the 7 files arranged in a row across the floor. For 11 years, she'd believed her family was poor because that was simply their fate, because her father had been unlucky. Now she knew her father hadn't died because of bad luck. He had died because someone had read the first report, understood exactly what it meant, then signed a different piece of paper so they wouldn't have to stop construction for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of schedule in exchange for 7 men. The next day, Chloe carried the box to Taylor Street. She placed it on the table in front of Donatello and opened the lid so he could see inside. He looked at the 2 reports lying on top and understood immediately. He said, "Give it to me." Chloe placed her hand on the lid and closed the box. She said no. Donatello looked up. Chloe said, "I know what you can do with these papers. I know that in 3 days he'll disappear, and no one will ask where he went." She said, "I don't want him to disappear. I want him sitting in a room with windows, in the middle of the day, while someone stands up and reads my father's name aloud, and I want him to sit there and listen." She said, "My father had a name. He wasn't a line in a budget." Donatello looked at her for a very long time. In his life, no one had ever sat across from him holding something that could destroy a man and refused his way to his face. He didn't try to persuade her. He didn't tell her that her way would take longer and might fail. He only nodded. On the 14th day exactly, Richard Ashford gave his answer. At 9 o'clock that night, 2 of Donatello's cars were traveling along the road leading toward the South Port when a small truck cut across in front of them and blocked the way. And 30 seconds later came something that no one in the organization would ever describe in detail afterward. Marco was shot in the left shoulder. He still managed to open the rear door, pull Donatello out of the car, and shove him down behind a concrete road barrier. It ended far faster than it felt to the people who were there. By the time the ambulance arrived, all that remained on the roadway was shattered glass and an abandoned truck with no license plates. Donatello wasn't hurt. He sat on the hospital steps for 3 hours with both hands resting on his knees. And he didn't say a single word to anyone. His men stood farther out, waiting for orders, and no orders came. That was what frightened them. If he had shouted, if he had smashed something, they would have known what to do, but he only sat there. The doctor came out and said Marco was going to survive, that his left shoulder would never be as strong as it had been. And Donatello gave one nod, then sat down again. He sat there and counted. That evening, he'd changed the route at the last moment. He hadn't taken the Beltway as the schedule had indicated. He'd changed it after 4 o'clock that afternoon, and only 4 people in the world knew which road he would take. Marco was 1, the second driver was 2, the dispatcher on duty was 3, and the 4th was the man Donatello had trusted since they were 7 years old. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Gabriel Moretti was brought to a warehouse in the Western Industrial District. No one put him in handcuffs. No one pointed anything at him. They simply opened the door, let him walk inside, then closed it behind him. Donatello was sitting on a wooden chair in the middle of the empty warehouse floor. He didn't stand. Gabriel stopped about 10 feet away and didn't dare sit down. The 2 men remained silent for a long time. Then Donatello spoke. He said, "How long?" Gabriel didn't ask what he meant. He said, 2 years. Donatello asked, "For what?" Gabriel stood there with his arms hanging at his sides, and he told him. He told him about a night 20 years earlier, when neither of them had even turned 20, when he'd been sent to do something that should never have been given to a kid. He said a man had died that night. He said, "I didn't mean to." He said, "I swear I didn't mean to." He said, "I buried it, and I've lived with it for 20 years. Then he said that 2 years earlier, Ashford had found something that proved what had happened, and for the first 6 months, he hadn't asked for money, hadn't asked for goods, hadn't asked for anything at all. He had only called. He had only checked in, until he started asking questions that an outsider should never have known enough to ask. Donatello listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt once. Then he asked the only question he wanted answered. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" Gabriel opened his mouth, but nothing came out at first. He shook his head, and when he finally answered, his voice had broken. He said, "Because you would have forgiven me." He said, "I knew you would, and I couldn't bear that." He said, "You've been forgiving me since we were 7 years old. You forgave everything. You never made me pay for anything. I stood beside you at your father's funeral with that dead man in my head, and you still put your hand on my shoulder." He said, "I'd rather let Ashford tighten a rope around my throat than sit across from you and watch you forgive me one more time." Then he said his name. He said Donatello. It was the name that only Gabriel was allowed to call him in the entire city, and he'd called him that for 31 years. Donatello stood. He walked forward, stopped in front of Gabriel, and didn't raise a hand. He said, "You'll be out of Illinois before sunrise." He said, "You won't call your mother again. Not once. Not one message." He said, "When she dies, someone will make sure everything is handled properly. There will be flowers. Someone will stand beside her coffin. But that person won't be you, and you won't be allowed to come." He said, "I won't touch you. I won't let anyone touch you. You'll live, and you'll live a very long time. And every day for the rest of your life, you'll wake up in a place where no one knows your name." He said, "That's my punishment." Gabriel nodded. He didn't beg. He didn't kneel. He simply stood there for a few more seconds, then asked one final question. He asked, "Will you ever forgive me?" Donatello looked at him for a very long time. Then he said, "Yes." He said, "I forgive you right now." He said, "But forgiveness doesn't mean leaving something untouched, and sometime in the next 20 years, you'll understand that." Gabriel began to cry. He turned away and walked out through the warehouse door, and he never looked back. Donatello remained where he was until the sound of the car had disappeared completely. Then he sat down again on the wooden chair in the middle of the empty warehouse floor, and stayed there until morning, alone, in a city where from that night forward, there was no one left who was allowed to call him by his name. 3 days later, someone knocked on the door of the Bridgeport apartment, close to 9 o'clock at night. Chloe opened it, and found Vivian Ashford standing there. She wasn't wearing any makeup. Her hair was tied at the nape of her neck, and she had come alone. There was no car waiting on the street below. Chloe didn't invite her inside. The 2 women stood in the shared hallway beneath a fluorescent light, with one end burned out. Vivian said, I didn't come here to apologize, because I know an apology now would sound like another performance. She said, I came to give you this. She held out a USB drive. Chloe didn't take it. Vivian said, that engagement wasn't mine. She said, my father needed capital from the fund Ethan worked for, and Ethan needed a family name that could get him into rooms where he otherwise wouldn't be invited. She said, I was the payment. She said, I knew it by the second month, and I still went to dress fittings, still chose flowers, still smiled for photographs. Chloe asked, then why me? Vivian was silent for quite a while. Then she said, because I was jealous. She said, not because of Ethan. I never wanted Ethan for a single day in my life. She said, I was jealous because you had something I couldn't buy at any price. She said, my entire life, not one man has ever chosen me for me. They chose the Ashford name. They chose the capital. They chose lunch with my father. She said, but you were chosen by someone when you were wearing a uniform and had nothing in your hands. Then she placed the USB drive on the hallway windowsill. She said, this contains the complete internal financial backup of Ashford Group, going back 8 years. She said, I started keeping it when I was 22. Chloe asked why. Vivian said, because I knew my father would sell me too. She said, I just didn't know he would sell me this soon. Then she turned away. At the top of the stairs, she stopped and added one more sentence without looking back. She said, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just want to do one thing in my life, because no one told me to do it. Chloe picked up the USB drive after the sound of Vivian's footsteps had faded down all 3 flights of stairs. She didn't say thank you. She didn't say I forgive you either. She simply stood in the hallway for a while longer, then closed the door. The deal collapsed within a week. No one explained anything, and there was no public statement. The calls simply stopped being returned. Ethan was fired on Friday, and by Monday his name appeared on the list of people who would have to answer questions from investigators. He came to the Coral Room on Tuesday night. The bar had been open again for 2 weeks. Marlene was behind the counter, and Kayla was working the floor. Ethan walked in and went straight to Chloe. He couldn't get a complete sentence out. He said her name twice. Then his knees gave way in the middle of the bar, both hands gripping the edge of the counter. There were around 20 people inside at the time, and every one of them turned to look. Chloe walked around the end of the bar. She didn't stand over him. She crouched down until she was at eye level with him and said 3 things. She said, stand up. She said, no one makes anyone kneel here. Then she said, the worst thing you did wasn't leaving me, Ethan. It was teaching me to believe that being treated that way was all I deserved. She stood upright and went back behind the bar. Marlene poured Ethan a glass of water, set it down in front of him, then told him he could leave whenever he felt steady enough to walk. No one in the bar said anything else. Ethan sat there for about 10 minutes, then walked out, and it was the last time Chloe ever saw him. The final 2 weeks of the agreement passed without anything happening. Marco was discharged from the hospital, his left arm still in a sling. The 30th day fell on a Thursday night. Donatello came to the bar after closing. He placed an envelope on the counter. Inside were papers formally ending their agreement, clearly dated, along with a sum of money she had never asked for. He said, it's done. He said, you're free. Chloe looked at the envelope without opening it. Then she asked him a question she'd been carrying in her mind for 3 weeks. She said, are you a good man, Donatello? It was the first time she'd ever called him by his name. He didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the surface of the bar, then raised his eyes and said no. He said, I'm not a good man. He said, I've done things I will never tell you about, and I won't apologize for them either. Then he said, but I've never lied to you once, and I'm not going to start tonight. Chloe stood there silently for a while. She thought about the 4th condition he'd recited to her in that closed restaurant on Taylor Street, and she understood that throughout those 30 days, he'd followed it even more strictly than she had. Then she pushed the envelope back toward him. She said, I'm staying, but I have a condition of my own. She said, you start pulling your part of the world away from the things that make other people bleed. You don't have to finish all at once. You don't have to finish this year, but you start. Donatello looked at her for a very long time. Then he extended his hand across the bar, just as he had on that first night, and he said, I always keep my word. The case lasted 5 months. The cardboard box was turned over to the federal prosecutor's office along with the USB drive, and from that point on, Chloe had nothing left to do except answer questions when they were asked. One by one, the 3 inspectors named in her father's notebook accepted cooperation agreements. By the 4th month, Richard Ashford pleaded guilty to avoid going to trial. The sentencing hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in October, inside a downtown courtroom with windows, in broad daylight, exactly as Chloe had said she wanted. She sat in the section reserved for victims' families. Beside her were the other 6 families. There was a woman in her 70s, with both hands resting on the purse in her lap. There were 2 brothers sitting with an empty seat between them who didn't say a single word to each other throughout the hearing. There was a middle-aged man who took off his glasses every few minutes to wipe them clean. For 11 years, all of them had lived in the same city, and not one had ever called another, because every one of them had signed a piece of paper promising never to speak of what had happened, and every one of them had believed they alone had been cowardly enough to sign it. That morning, they sat beside one another for the first time. The original inspection report was entered into the record and read aloud before the court. The prosecutor read slowly. He read all of page 3. He even read the sentence that had been underlined in ballpoint pen 11 years earlier. When he reached the words "halt construction," no one in the room moved. Then he lowered the paper and said the court would now hear the names of those who had died. He began to read. The first name. The woman in her 70s gave a small nod. The second name. The 2 brothers sitting 1 seat apart lowered their heads at the same moment. The third name. The middle-aged man removed his glasses and didn't put them back on. Then the prosecutor read the 4th name. Tom Callahan, 47 years old, scaffolding crew foreman. Chloe had prepared herself for that moment for 5 months. She had thought she would cry, but she didn't. She simply sat a little straighter, both hands resting on her knees, and listened. She listened to every word, and she let them travel all the way through that room. For 11 years, that name had existed only in faded lettering on a mailbox, and in a photograph buried at the bottom of a cardboard box. No one had spoken it aloud. No one had been allowed to speak it aloud. Now it was being read clearly, in a courtroom with windows, in broad daylight, in front of the man who had signed that paper, and that man had to sit there and listen. Chloe looked toward the defense table. Richard Ashford sat with his back to her. He didn't turn around, but when the name was read, his shoulders dropped slightly, and they stayed that way through the remaining 3 names. During the recess, Chloe stepped into the hallway to get some water. Ashford approached and stopped where he blocked half the passage. He spoke very quietly. He named the facility where her mother was being treated, and he got the name exactly right. He said the transplant had been scheduled for January, and he said he even knew the doctor's name. He said, "I still have friends, Miss Callahan, even in there." Chloe didn't step back. She looked directly at him and said, "You took my father from me, 11 years from me, and all of my youth. You don't have anything left to take." Then she added one more thing. She said, "You didn't even know who I was when you signed the order shutting down that hospital fund last year, did you?" Ashford froze. From the far end of the hallway, Donatello came toward them. He didn't say a single word to Ashford. He didn't touch him. He simply placed a brown envelope on the bench beside where Ashford stood, then kept walking, and he stopped at the other end of the hallway to wait for Chloe. Ashford stared at the envelope for a moment before picking it up. He pulled out the papers inside. He read the first line, the second. By the third, his hand had begun to shake. It was 8 years of internal financial records from his own company. Records he had believed existed nowhere in the world except on a locked server. He turned to the final page. The signature there was his own, but in the upper corner of the first page was an official receipt stamp showing that the documents had been submitted 3 days before the hearing, and beneath it was the name of the person who had delivered the first copy to the federal prosecutor's office, Vivian Ashford. He stood in the middle of the hallway with the papers in his hands, and he couldn't read another line. That afternoon, the court imposed sentence. Richard Ashford was convicted of conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery of public officials, obstruction of justice, and falsification of records. Ashford Group filed for bankruptcy 3 weeks later. All 7 silence agreements were declared void because they had been obtained through fraud, and all 7 families had their right to pursue civil claims restored. Ethan Brooks received a suspended sentence and was barred from working in the financial industry. When the hearing ended, no one cheered. The 7 families stood, and the woman in her 70s was the first to turn and shake the hand of the person beside her. Then, one by one, they shook hands with each other, slowly and awkwardly, like old acquaintances meeting again after too many years of being afraid to speak one another's names. Chloe was the last person to leave the courtroom. The transplant took place on a January morning and lasted 2 hours longer than expected. Chloe sat in the waiting room for 7 hours without eating anything. Close to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the doctor came out and said it had been successful. The kidney had started working while Susan was still on the operating table. Chloe thanked him, then walked into the hallway, leaned her back against the wall, and sank down onto the floor. 4 years of taking her mother to dialysis 3 times a week. 4 years of sleeping 2.5 hours a night. She cried then, holding nothing back anymore, until a nurse passing by had to sit down beside her. Susan woke the next morning. She was still weak, but she recognized her daughter the moment she opened her eyes. She took Chloe's hand. She said, "I heard everything. Someone told me what happened that day in court." Then she rested for a moment, breathing slowly, and said, "Your father always told me you were just like him. He used to say that girl doesn't know how to bow her head." She said, "I always thought it was a compliment. Turns out it was a prophecy." Chloe bent down and pressed her forehead against the back of her mother's hand, and the two of them stayed that way for a long time without saying another word. In 11 years, it was the first time neither of them had needed to lie to the other. 1 year later, the sign outside the bar had changed. It no longer said the Coral Room. It said Callahan's. Marlene worked behind the bar 6 nights a week, and she still kept her rule that no female employee went home alone after 2 o'clock in the morning. Kayla worked weekends and had gone back to school at night to study social work. She said she wanted to work with families who didn't know what rights they had. On the wall behind the bar hung a framed photograph of 7 men in reflective safety vests, standing in front of a half-finished construction site. There was no caption beneath it. If anyone asked, Marlene would tell them. That same year, a legal aid fund bearing the name Tom Callahan began operating, dedicated to helping the families of workers injured on the job who couldn't afford an attorney. The founder's name appeared nowhere, and no one at the fund had ever seen the face of the person who had provided the money. Vivian Ashford left Chicago in the spring, took her mother's last name, and no one knew where she went. Once a year, Chloe received an unsigned postcard with only a few words about the weather in some distant place. She kept them in a drawer, in the same place as the black card. Marco was walking normally again. His left arm was still weaker than before, but he continued to insist on driving himself. As for Donatello, he had sold off 3 of the 6 parts of his old business. The other 3 were still there. He hadn't promised to be rid of everything within a year, and he didn't lie by pretending everything was clean now. He worked slowly, 1 piece at a time, and every time another part was gone, he said the same thing to her. 3 left, then 2. One night near the end of October, the bar was getting ready to close. Marlene had gone home. Kayla had gone home. Only Chloe remained, wiping down the counter and turning the last few glasses upside down. The back door opened. A man stepped inside without saying anything, walked over, and sat down in the old chair in the farthest corner, looking just as he had more than 3 years earlier, when he sat in the storage room with a cloth pressed against his side. His clothes were wet because it was raining outside. Chloe didn't ask where he'd been, and she didn't ask what had happened that night. She simply took a clean glass, poured a measure of whiskey, and set it in front of him. He sat there with both hands resting on the wooden table, and drank slowly. Just like the first night, there was only one difference. This time, she knew who he was, and she poured the drink anyway. The priceless dress had never made Chloe Callahan worth more. She was still the woman who had stopped a stranger's bleeding in a storage room without asking a single question. Still the daughter who had taken her mother to dialysis for 4 years without once complaining. The dress had done only one thing. It had forced 300 people in that room to see the value that had already been there inside her all along. A person's worth isn't found in what they wear, in the balance of their bank account, or in the family name they carry. It is found in the way they treat someone who has nothing to give them in return. And the greatest evil in this story never held a gun. It sat in an air-conditioned conference room, signed a piece of paper to save 2 weeks on a construction schedule, then went out to lunch. It didn't hate anyone. It simply didn't consider the people beneath it to be people at all. 17 people sat inside the bar that night. 300 people stood inside the ballroom on Saturday night. Not one of them threw the apron or tilted the glass of wine, but every one of them was there, and every one of them stayed silent. Silence is a choice too, and sometimes it is the very thing that allows everything else to continue. What do you think gives a human being their true worth? And in the life around you, have you ever witnessed someone being treated as though they didn't deserve to exist? Leave a comment below. We truly want to hear what you feel from the deepest part of your heart. If today's story touched you, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so you can hear compelling stories every day. We wish every one of you watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.